All right. So once again, welcome to everybody. It's a pleasure to see you here. We have our first quote unquote live event of the semester for the QRM course. We are joined by Nicole Sithole, who has taken some time out of her morning to talk to us about her really fascinating work, including oral history. So this is your chance today to, first of all, listen to the presentation, but then really engage with us on the topic of oral history, what it means to conduct interviews. Here you've got experts assembled that you can kind of share your thoughts with and enter into discussion. So without further ado, let me please introduce our speaker. As I said, Nicole Sithole has very recently actually completed her PhD at the University of Cambridge. And she's working on gender, labor, domestic life, and power in Rhodesia, especially on the Rhodesian Railways, so today's Zimbabwe. And there she examines how African women and men navigated racialized and gendered hierarchies in these railway communities. So she's currently writing a book about this based on her dissertation. And this will retain a very empirical focus on Zimbabwe, but it will engage with larger global history debates. So her work really intersects then sort of very national African historiography with larger debates in global history. She also is really interested in examining archives and specifically archival silences. And she wants to demonstrate how gaps in colonial records obscure women's experiences and how one needs to read those archives very carefully, both along and against the grain, to recover these marginalized voices. And finally, she's also not only studied history, but she completed degrees in politics and international relations, as well as history at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. So please welcome Nicole. And now, Nicole, the floor is all yours. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. It's really lovely to be giving this lecture today, and I hope you thoroughly enjoy it and that we can have a lovely discussion at the end of it. So today my presentation is titled Voices from the Track, Gender, Oral History, and Railway Communities in Colonial Zimbabwe. And as I begin that, I just want to talk a little bit about who I am and what my research is. Marcia has so graciously given a lovely introduction about myself, where I did my PhD, my undergrad. This project that I was working on for my PhD actually started off when I was a master's student. I kind of stumbled into the project. My master's supervisor at that point had a railway project and she asked me to work on it. And I naively decided I was going to work on African women on the railways in colonial Zimbabwe without ever having entered into the archive. I made this decision based solely on the fact that what I had read about the railways in Zimbabwe didn't include much about women at all. I would just get one or two sentences regarding their activities or their significance in the history of the railways in Zimbabwe, but nothing else aside from that. So I went into the master's and realized once I entered the archive during my master's degree, I then realized there wasn't much in the archive that I could actually work with that would help me develop my thesis. So my master's thesis ended on a slightly sad note where I had a lot of questions, but the questions then helped me develop my PhD. So my PhD dissertation started off as a story of women, solely as a story of women, but then I realized that I couldn't tell the story of women on the railways without unpacking the stories of men themselves. So it explores the gender dynamics in railway communities, in African railway communities, with the aim of unearthing those hidden and silenced female voices. So I look at the Rhodesia Railways, which became the National Railways of Zimbabwe at independence. And the Rhodesia Railways was established in 1899, and it was put in place to administer networks across colonial Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Botswana. So like I said, previous research had focused primarily on men if it wasn't the pioneers who built the railways, the financiers who, funded the railways, or then the workers. So what my research does is it challenges this very male-focused history and looks into the important roles that African women played as wives, mothers, small business owners, and then from the late 1970s, official railway employees. For white women on the railways, some research has been done and a lot more archival evidence is available. Yes, so my project also thinks about the railway worker less as a unit of labor, so just as a worker for the railways, but also humanizes them and thinks of them as thinks of workers as fathers, husbands, brothers, and sons. And by doing this, actually, we learn more. I argue that we learn more about the railways, about what was happening during this period that I study, which is 1945 to 1985. Just a little bit of information on why I chose 1945 to 1985. There's a lot of important things happening in colonial Zimbabwe, in the region itself, in southern Africa, on the continent as a whole, and of course globally. So this is just after World War I ended, 1945. There's a lot happening with workers. There are strikes going on all throughout Africa, but also globally at this time. In Zimbabwe, there's something called the Central African Federation that is created that is of significance, where Zimbabwe and Zambia form a federation. And then in 1965, also an important thing that happens is that there's a legal unilateral declaration of independence from Britain. So colonial Zimbabwe was a British colony, and at this point, the white minority government declares its independence. And then from 1965, after UDI, which is what I just spoke about, until 1980, then there's the War of Liberation that occurs, the War of Independence. This is the decolonial period. And then 1980, Zimbabwe gains independence. So 1980 to 1985, within my project, we're looking at the post-colonial era in Zimbabwe. So that's just a little bit of information on my time period. I look at Harare and Bulawayo. Those are my focus areas. And then the core argument in my research is that gender and race shaped both the public employment and private domestic lives. So everything that was happening in the workplace was connected to what was happening in the home and vice versa. Now, getting to the real crux of the matter for this lecture. So you guys are thinking about oral history. So I posed the question, why oral history? And for me, it was about complementing the colonial archive. So I mentioned before that there's very little that I know about African women, or that I knew about African women based only on the colonial archive. In my dissertation, I write about scatterings, fragments, bits and pieces that I had. So I wondered, what could I do with those bits and pieces? So oral interviews became very, very important for me. So the archive silences as one of my blocks there in my presentation. So colonial records were produced by and for the railway company and the state, and therefore what is recorded in the archive reflects that. So African women only appeared as problems or when they posed a challenge to the colonial state or to the railways. That's where we get these fragments, these pieces and these scatterings. And some of these, another issue was that, which I also kind of mentioned at the beginning, was that African railwaymen were recorded only as workers in the colonial archive. So they mattered to the colonial administration and to the railway company only as it affected their company profits, when it had to do with their productivity. And then there were other issues, such as issues of housing. And I thought those could have been significant. So the oral interviews that I conducted then helped me fill in some of these gaps that I had. So if I had fragments and then I had oral histories, they would then complement each other. So I also read the colonial archives along and against the grain. So I treated these archives critically. What I had in front of me, I didn't just take it at face value. I thought, what can this document tell me about what I am trying to research? And then how do the oral histories fill in the gaps for the information that I have? So I used court records, company files, newspapers, and what they revealed, um, if when I read the archive along and against the grain, was that African railway women were actually very significant in the history of the railways. Um, they tell us about the lives of these women, but also the lives of African railwaymen beyond the workplace, which helps us better understand what was happening on the railways at the time. So my oral I had 15 semi-structured interviews with former Rhodesia Railway employees who later became NRZ employees, which is the National Railways of Zimbabwe. And the selection criteria was that they had to have worked on the railways between 1945 and 1985, the time frame of my study, of course. So out of the 15 interviews that I did, 9 were used in my thesis. 7 were of men and 2 women, and they covered different grades, different types of jobs, and I tried to also split them up between the different locations. Now, the fact that there were 7 men and 2 women actually reflects the gender dynamics of the railways. The railways in colonial Zimbabwe, but actually globally at this time and before, were a highly hyper-masculine place. So the railways were governed by masculine ethos, and the majority of the labor force actually were men. The ideas that infiltrated really had like a very masculine feel to it and a sense to it. So this is also then reflected in the number of women that I could get to be interviewed. They weren't many women working on the railways, white or black at the time. So then how did I find participants? This was actually a very interesting part of my research. Now that I reflect on it, I can reflect on it fondly. At the time, it was a bit stressful for me. This was the first time I had conducted interviews before. And how I did this was I had to create trust, and kinship and community networks were very, very important for me. So in Harare, one of my first stops was at the National Railways of Zimbabwe Pensioners Office, which is right in the city center. And when I went to that office, I met a lady, a woman named Hilda Ramushu, who became such a pivotal part of my project. Not only because she was one of the 2 women that I was able to interview, but also because she then introduced me to other participants in the research. And this was so important because I actually faced challenges in getting interviewees. And having her on board to assist me so willingly, and so with such enthusiasm, was so essential for the success of my project. So that was in Harare. Hilda introduced me to people like Perkins Karuma, who also was an important person in my research. Actually, all of the people I interviewed in my research were extremely important and contributed very different things to my work. And Bulawayo, interestingly, my grandmother, Mrs. Zingeni, was so, so, so important. So Okay, let me just go back to Harare for a second. So when I was in Harare, I went to the NRZ pensioners office, but I also walked around in railway communities. One of the ones that I did was Rugari, and in Rugari is the headquarters of the pensioners union. And when I was there with they walking around in Rugari, I experienced quite a bit of backlash from the pensioners union because they were suspicious of why I was conducting my research. So even though I presented them with the information on my research and tried to demonstrate that it actually wasn't political at all, because Zimbabwe is quite a politically charged environment with a lot of issues that can cause these these tensions, they were still very suspicious of me. So even though I had walked around a number of times and had started um, to gain trust from my potential participants, the intervention of the pensioners union stalled any progress that I had made. Um, so in Harare, my attempt to get participants by myself was stalled. And I'll explain that, I'll discuss that a little bit more in my next slide. But then in Bulawayo, so I then left Harare and went to Bulawayo, and I was a little bit discouraged. And then I went and I did the same thing. I went walking around different railway communities. It wasn't as difficult as in Harare, but still people were not so keen to speak to me. Some were interested, but they couldn't legitimize me. They just didn't trust me. Um, but my grandmother, Mrs. Zingini, then offered to walk around with me in some of these communities. And interestingly, participants were more open to talking to me when I was in the presence of an older woman. So she facilitated introductions to people like Leferson Shumba and Isnet Manyao. But actually, my grandmother knew these people from way before. So Bulawayo is a railway city, so there are a lot of railway workers. And my grandmother had been a resident of Bulawayo for many, many years. So then she immediately actually had the idea that she wanted to introduce me to people she knew had worked on the railways. So she would make the initial introduction, and then I would be left to, continue with my business. Visiting the Bulawayo Railway Museum also yielded further connections. The curator of the museum was exceptionally helpful. I interviewed him, and he also connected me to other people that he thought would be interesting for me to interview. Excuse me. So there were no formal lists of eligible pensioners that I could use, which would have probably made the interviewing process a little bit easier. I really had to walk around, ask around, and really rely on these networks of trust, kinship, and community. So all of this that I've just talked about created this insider-outsider dynamic that actually shaped the interview process. So I am a Zimbabwean woman and I am researching at a British university, and that really mattered enormously. I think one of the biggest hesitations of the pensioners union was the fact that I was from the university, well, I was studying at the University of Cambridge. There was a lot of questions about what my motivations were, like I said, and at this time and now, there's an issue of pensions. Railway pensions there's a lot of corrupt activity happening at that point. So people suspected that maybe I was using my project of gender to try and delve into these more sensitive issues. Yeah, but what marked me as an insider for this project, and as I was doing my work, was that I am Zimbabwean and I speak the language. So the three most predominant languages spoken in Zimbabwe are Shona, Ndebele, and English. So English is used like more in in the schooling, in government, in the day-to-day functionings of the country. But Shona, about 70% of the population speaks Shona, about 20% speak Ndebele, and then 10% goes to the other minority languages. We have 16 official languages in the country. So the fact that I was able to communicate in all of these languages, or these three, marked me as an insider. Then my family networks as well. I mentioned my grandmother, my father, who I discuss a little bit more in the next slide, was also instrumental in helping create this insider identity. Without them, I think I would have struggled a lot more to kind of bridge this gap. And then women like Hilda Ramushu trusted me through their shared gender experience, creating this insider identity. What marked me as an outsider, studying at a British university, then, the workers' union questioning others about why I was doing this project, and then the pensions issue that I already mentioned. So gender in the research process. So gender was both a barrier and a bridge in conducting these oral interviews. And what the fieldwork did was it actually mirrored the patriarchal dynamics I was researching. So in Rugari, I told you how I had been walking around, faced challenges. I actually left for Bulawayo without having completed one interview, and this was after maybe 2.5 months. When I then returned from Bulawayo and came back to Harare, then just that maybe we walk around together in Rugari. Um, we go back and visit the people I had already started creating networks of trust with. And then he would just sit there silently, or maybe reintroduce me at first. At first, I was a little bit, I didn't like the idea. But then I thought, okay, let's give it a shot, because at the point actually I like to call my dad my Uber driver when I'm in Zimbabwe. He was driving me around. So I thought, okay, if you're going to be dropping me off, maybe we can try it in one place. And he did. And interestingly, when he reintroduced me, all he did was reintroduce me as his daughter who was doing a PhD, and he would really appreciate it if they would listen to what I have to say. And when I spoke in the presence of my father, people were more open to be interviewed. The people, obviously, a lot of them were men. So men were more willing to be interviewed by me after my father reintroduced me. So this legitimized my research in a way that I hadn't been able to do by myself. It was very uncomfortable for me, having my father there, initially, but then it was also really revealing, as the dynamics that were shaping access mirrored those shaping my history. And I only came to this conclusion much later. And then my grandmother and Hilda Mushu, really, really pivotal also for my research. Women facilitated access through their own networks and authority. So my grandmother opened doors for me in Bulawayo, and Hilda at the NRZ Pensions Union in Harare introduced me to further participants. So throughout this whole research, gender operated as both a barrier and a bridge, depending entirely on the context. So the silence of wives, the silence of women within the oral interviewing process itself. One woman said, "My husband should speak because he was the railway employee." And this was really, really revealing, because at a number of the interviews that I conducted, wives were actually present in the house. But they consistently deferred to their husbands because they were not employed by the railways. But I made it very clear that I was also very interested in what was happening in the home, because one of my main arguments was that what was happening in the home and what was happening in the workplace were connected. So this left me with a lot of questions, whether this reflected genuine agency, because silence actually can be read as agency. The decision not to speak is agency. So whether this was that, or maybe political caution, or internalized beliefs about women's peripheral relevance to the railways, remains uncertain. And that uncertainty itself is part of the story. So whilst at the time of the interviewing process, I was quite discouraged that more women weren't participating, because I had wanted this to be a story of women, actually. In the end, I realized I was able to see that their decision not to speak was actually an important part of the story. So as a result, my study actually relies heavily on male voices and archival materials that reflect these male perspectives. And this is a limitation that I address by reading the sources along and against the grain, which I discussed in an earlier slide, and analyzing court records where African women appear. I wonder if you can still see me. You might not be able to see me, but can you still hear me, Marcia?
Yes, we hear you fine. We just lost your image.
Okay, great. So I'll continue. So some of the ethical considerations when conducting sensitive research. So all of my participants were fully informed about the purpose of the research and were given consent forms that they had to sign. And interviews were recorded with the participants' knowledge. And my plan for the future is to make these interviews accessible for researchers in the future. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit just now. So the language interviews were conducted in a choice of either English, Shona, or Ndebele, which I am proficient in all of them. Many opted for English, whilst others would just, kind of mix between the different languages based on the ease. But the fact that they chose English actually reflected the railway company's emphasis on English as the marker of status and advancement. So railway workers, despite their grade, whether they were just a laborer, which would have been a lower grade, or a train driver, which was a much higher grade, they spoke excellent English and they wanted to be able to reflect that railway respectability through their use of English. Privacy and dignity, which is very important. So I took care to ensure that where participants required privacy, that was given to them, and there was always dignity in how I conducted these interviews, especially when it came to discussing sensitive issues such as things that could have been illegal or morally contested activities, such as strikes and things that have to do with the informal economy and prostitution. And then the archival access. So I already said that oral interviews will be made available to future researchers, recognizing the value of these voices belong beyond just the single study. So future researchers will also be able to work with this document, with this source, and derive their own interpretations from these interviews. So we can see from this that oral testimonies do not just sit in an archive, they continue to live. So I'm continuing to use them now as I'm working on my book. Other researchers will use them later. And these, making sure that I went through the right ethical steps allows researchers to then be able to give these sources an afterlife, an important afterlife, because actually many of the interviewees will ask, so what happens to our interviews after this? Is it just for your research? What else happened afterwards? So these sources continue to live, and then they even change in meaning and affect people long after the interview is over. So what did my oral histories reveal? So one of the most interesting things for me was that interviews challenged my assumptions about women's experiences on the railways. So one of my favorite quotes is from Hilda Mushu, where she said to me, "I have always been one of the boys." When she said that to me, I was so surprised because I thought from what I had seen in the archive, the railways were a hyper-masculine environment. And even as I began to read along and against the grain and look for these more and more traces of women and issues of gender, I saw that the workplace and even the home was structured in ways that favored men. But then Hilda, who was the first African woman to be employed by the Rhodesia Railways in 1979, when she entered employment, she said she did not feel any kind of gender discrimination. She wasn't treated any differently. Maybe the only difference that she had was a different kind of accommodation. That she couldn't stay in rooms next to men because the men just felt that it wasn't comfortable. That was the only thing that she said, okay, I remember that. Otherwise, in every other regard, as she started training, they never treated her any differently. They never carried any equipment for her because she was a woman. They just treated her as one of the boys. And to this day, when you see her around the other railway pensioners, she, interacts with them as if she were one of the boys. So her experience showed that gender relations on the railways were more complex than I initially assumed, which was brilliant, because if I had just worked with the archive itself, actually I wouldn't have been able to develop to write the PhD itself. But these oral histories then supplemented and complemented that. And then I also learned about the railway family. The railway family was something that I picked up in colonial records, but then the interviews themselves then just added meat to the bones. And the oral interviews showed me that this railway family identity, which was structured from a company level, but then became important to workers and their families, remained strong after independence. So even today, as railway pensioners meet in their offices or wherever they have their little get-togethers, they still relate to each other as this family, and they have a strong railway pride, despite the sadness and the grief that comes with the fact that our railways in Zimbabwe are not doing so well. Although actually in the last 2, 3 years there have been some attempts to resuscitate the railways in quite meaningful ways. So railway workers also challenged gender labels and fought for equal reputation, recognition. Another quote that I really liked is from Esther Manyao, who said, "We are not talking of railwaymen here, we are talking of railway people." So she completely rejected the idea of railwaymen because in most narratives or in most conversations, people refer to railwaymen, and Esther said, "No, we are not railwaymen, we're not railway women, we are railway people." She insisted everybody could be called a railway person because she believed anyone who worked for the railways, no matter their gender or job, deserved equal respect and recognition. So that was just a brilliant insight that she introduced as part of our interview. So yes, that is the little presentation that I have for you. And as we continue with our discussion, I just hoped we could have some questions, could, kind of mull over. And if you have any other questions as well that you have, that would be great. So the questions that I have are based on actually all of the stuff that I talked about in the presentation just now. So yes, thank you. Thank you. Maybe we can get on with the conversation.
Thank you so much, Nicole. This was really truly an insightful and brilliant presentation, and I think we all took a lot away from it.